Mike, I want to talk a little bit about collegiate experience and especially the question of coping with stress. I mean, stress is a common denominator in our modern world. We all experience stress. I have certain stresses connected with my job as a campus minister. You know, I feel that as many responsibilities I have to attend to a number of people. We have to prepare decent liturgies. I have to get my independent studies ready for my students and so on. I mean, there's a lot of demands, and it creates a certain amount of stress, especially if you allow it to. But the collegiate life from the student viewpoint also has its own stresses, and those are the ones that I want to explore a bit with you. Want to tell me a little bit about ways students you think experience stress today? What are the things that cause it, and how are people coping with it, and so on?
Well, I think for the collegiate, the biggest stress that you have is the academic stress of doing well, of getting everything on time, being confined to a schedule of that this has to be done by such and such a date. Then, if you're the student who is involved in extracurricular activities, that just adds to the stress. Although I don't see that as causing a lot of stress because you can always pull back on those. But with the academics, you have to be moving forward. You have to be meeting the schedule, the deadline. Whereas if you're in some activity, you know, you do have certain responsibilities to meet, but you know, you can always know that next quarter I'm going to be dropping out of that activity or pulling back. So the biggest stress causer would be the classwork. The demands of the academic world. And of course that's why you're there. I mean, you're there to study and to learn, and so that figures. I think there's studies done recently suggesting that collegians do indeed spend a lot of hours a week dealing with academic matters. The numbers that are coming to my mind purely from memory are like 35 to 40 hours a week. I believe the studies were suggesting this is a full-time job, in other words, to take class. How many hours do you usually take in a quarter? Not in the past, in your first couple of years at the university. I was usually around 16 or 17, and they say, at least at Toledo, that you're supposed to, for every hour of class you're taking, multiply that by 3 for your total hours of the week, which that gets up to be about 50 or so.
Yes, you are working overtime, Mike. Would that be a standard load, the 16 hours?
Basically, for a full-time student, they call 12 to 16 hours, and then I think most people go toward the 16 end.
15, commonly hear that. You know.
Right.
Right, so that if you did follow through with the standard, you'd be putting in a lot of hours just on the academics. And then also, you pointed out, I mean, a lot of the stress has to do with time elements, doesn't it? I mean, there's deadlines, and there's papers due on a certain date, and there's the midterm test that's coming up in 1 week, and there's the finals that come before you ever expected they would be here, and so on. In other words, there's sort of a crammed character to it very often. One of the things that I was thinking about, if we do say that time is a big element in it, that one would have to deal with the problem of procrastination in dealing with stress. I mean, you take somebody who has a paper to do in a quarter and they wait till the last 3 days to try to get it done, well, of course, they're in a frenzy. I mean, and the anxiety level increases greatly. So if I was just looking at it in a common sense way and counseling that person, I would say, well, you want to deal better with stress, why don't you, as soon as the paper is assigned, go and do something on it. Get started. Not write the whole thing today, but as soon as it's assigned, go and do some research on it, or look up some articles, or jot down some ideas. Get yourself started. That's one of the techniques in time management you learn in dealing with procrastination, is to break the large task down into manageable units, so that it might just seem overwhelming to finish this whole paper, but if you're able to say, well, at least I could write the introduction, or write the first paragraphs better than the introduction, or at least I could do a little research on it, or at least try to outline what I'm trying to do. That makes it a manageable task. And then one ought to get on with it quickly and get it done, and then that hopefully opens up the door. I think what happens sometimes is you get going on it and you get the outline and say, well, I could start to write this, and maybe it even could become interesting, you know, or fascinating or challenging, and you can turn it around. Instead of being a great item of stress, it could become sort of part of the growth process, a challenge that one enjoys. Enjoy might be too lofty a word for talking about finishing a paper, but at least there could be some personal satisfaction in it seems to me. So, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that's true, and I think the problem, though, for the stress with a college student is that he's not used to managing his time. In high school, for the most part, it was easy to put things off because the projects weren't nearly as demanding. They were smaller, so that you could do it the weekend before without causing yourself a lot of stress. Now you come to the college environment, and you have these bad habits of putting things off and say, well, I can still do what I did in high school, and you don't realize that the demands are much greater, so that causes a lot of stress for the collegian that he hasn't had to deal with before because he hasn't really had the experience.
Yes, that raises a couple things. One is the formation of good habits and patterns in studying and knowing how to approach the intellectual world. And the other idea of experience. I mean, a lot of times it is experience that enables us to deal with stress, that we learn a technique, and we learn that by using that technique we managed it, and it didn't kill us or submerge us or totally mess our head up. Therefore, we can employ that coping mechanism the next time, and as we begin the task, it becomes easier for us. So, I mean, there can be a particular test that is just terribly frightening. However, if you look back and say, well, I had tough material before, and if I outlined it carefully and took notes well in class and studied over the material 2 or 3 days ahead of time, did all of these things, that therefore I really did cope well with it. You know, I passed the test, or I did reasonably well. I used my talents in a proper fashion. So I think that kind of experience is helpful in knowing how to manage these stressful situations that arise in the collegiate experience. What other kind of things are involved here in the academic side of it? I suppose stress comes from the fact that one might fail or not live up to one's potential.
The potential or own expectations.
That's better said, yeah.
If you are planning on doing so well, and you know that you've always done very well in school, if you have a quarter that you have, for whatever reason, you do poorly, that causes a great deal of stress and anxiety just the whole quarter, because you can tell after the first couple weeks if it started to go bad, and that if you realize this is not going to be a good quarter, you've got then 10 weeks to think about, well, you know, maybe I can do something to fix it, but you know, I also have all these other outside problems, which for whatever reason might not be the student's problem, but still he has to deal with them. And the fear of failure is a big part, but also the fear of just not doing as well as was originally planned.
Right. That's probably a more common experience, as you said, failing to live up to one's own personal expectations, which are often connected in, however, with the expectations of others, especially parents, which gives us another slant on this thing of what role parents play in helping collegians deal with the stresses of university life. Part of it, it seems to me, is to have sort of a realistic outlook about one's offspring and their capabilities, and not to treat them as their older brother and sister who did tremendously well in school. In other words, there's a uniqueness about each person, and our talents differ, and parents, it seems, have to have a sense of that. So, I mean, I deal with collegians periodically who are just stressed out because they can't possibly live up to the expectations of their parents. And sometimes those ideals are simply out of bounds. They don't accord with reality. They expect more of their students than is really reasonable. Sometimes, maybe depending on high school experience, might have gone to a small school, excelled in many ways, and they forget that they're now in competition with large numbers of people. You know, whether you're talking about extracurricular activities, getting into plays or concerts or band or athletic teams, it's a very different situation. And sometimes you can't just go by the high school achievement record. So parents really need to be a help in all this. I guess part of that would be to pay attention to the uniqueness of their offspring, their particular son or daughter, and to try to help them to compete really against their own realistic potential and not some idealized notion of how they ought to turn out, or some high standard set by an older brother or sister. I think it's that realism that would help in all this, and maybe to be able to say that, to communicate it, because there's a lot of sort of non-verbalized messages that might come across, like we expect you to really get all A's at a collegiate level, or be a 4-point student, or whatever the number happens to be. That would have to be explicitly stated very often, it seems to me, that we're with you and we recognize your limitations, and how you do your best. All we can ask is that you make a decent effort at it, and we'll be happy with that. That kind of message, I think, would help a lot of collegians.
I think so too. I think, unfortunately, what happens a lot of times is that most parents are willing to say that, and they do actually know it in their mind, but oftentimes they are conveying in other nonverbal ways that, well, we still expect you to do as well as your older brother or sister, or we still are expecting this, although they're always saying, just do whatever you can. And the parent might not even be conveying that at all, but the student himself feels, well, I have to do it because that's what they're expecting, even though the parent might not be expecting it.
Yes, that question of expectations is crucial. And of course, when we talk like that, it's not just a collegiate experience, because we're dealing with some lifelong attitudes, aren't we? You form a lot of your proper judgments of things during the collegiate years. You form your personality and character. You set up patterns of reactions, develop virtues and habits. And I think that a lot of that can go wrong. You can become a lifelong overachiever. You can become a workaholic during the collegiate years in a way that will carry on all the way through, where you're trying to work for some impossible standard or live up to some ideal that is totally out of touch with reality. So you really can build up habits like that are destructive in the business world or in trying to make family life work. I mean, how often do parents end up having that perfectionism from their own student years and then try to put it upon their own offspring then? I mean, certainly a common transfer from one family to the next generation. So we got stresses connected with the academic world. A lot of, has to do with the limited character of a given term, whether a semester or quarter. I mean, the quarter system has often seemed to me to produce its own pressures. It seems like you just start and then you have the pressure of midterms, and then soon the finals are upon you. It is all so confined temporally that it really does create a lot of extra stress, it seems to me. I'm sure there's a lot of arguments for having the quarter system. There's a lot of flexibility in it, especially in an urban university and so on. But from my viewpoint, and just thinking of it in terms of stress and people having time to do other things, extracurriculars, and getting involved and generally socializing, growing, and finding their identity and so on, the more leisurely pace of the semester has always had greater appeal to me, at least. Not sure, because you only know one system, don't you? You've always gone to school under quarter systems.
Right. So
it's hard for you to tell. But it is true, is it not? You just could start and midterms are upon you.
Right. You do. I wouldn't know to judge, but under the quarter system, you do feel you're constantly moving, because with the midterms also, you're registering for next quarter by the third, fourth week. You have to be into your advisor. And at that point, when you're starting to think about the next quarter, it's hard to be thinking about the quarter that you're in, whereas I think if you had more time, all of that stress, you could be living in the quarter that you're working with, and not so much always concerned with what's coming up, because it's not so direct. It's not so...
I'm sure individuals differ on that. I'm sure some people would find it less stressful because they're in a difficult class and they know it'll only last 10 weeks and they're out of it and can start another class that might be more interesting or not as difficult and so on. Well, Mike, part of this stress on campus has to do as well with, as you suggested at the beginning, the extracurricular things. I would like to think that some of the extracurricular things are a way of handling the stress, so that some people might be in the band, and while it does take up time, what it's really doing is developing their more creative side, or giving them a new set of friends, or enabling them to participate in something they enjoy, which really makes life easier. I mean, a lot of times we deal with stress by putting it into a larger context. I mean, people who are stressed out in a particular relationship at work often find that, well, in the home setting they can relax, and that's where they find their affirmation and where they feel at home and comfortable and so on. And then they are able to deal better with the stressful relationship at work because they have that. So I think that part of the way we deal with stress is to have a context that provides us some enjoyment in life and provides some deeper satisfactions and enables us to develop our talents in different ways. So maybe that's one of the things that being in the ski club or involved in student government or being involved in the Newman Club or whatever does help in that way, providing some socializing and some enjoyable kind of activities.
I think a lot of that has to deal with how intensely you become involved in the extracurricular activities. If you can take it with an attitude of that this is something for my enjoyment, that I will become a better person, I can be part of a community, all of the positive aspects, and you look at it that way, then it is great to help deal with stress because you have this thing that's still kind of connected with college life, but yet is away from the academics. Unfortunately, I think for some people, they become very, very intense with just one activity, and it no longer becomes just a way to relax. It becomes a cause of more stress.
Mm-hmm. And again, a lot of that's got to do with managing time, doesn't it? I mean, I think people who are involved in our parish, for example, they might be taking 16 hours. They might be working another 10 hours a week at some job or more, and they might then be involved in the executive board of our Newman Club and have particular committee responsibilities and have to get ready for events and run the Fast for World Harvest or help plan a penance service or get ready for a retreat. And a lot of that is very time-consuming and takes up a lot of energy. So surely part of the question of stress here is tied in with time management and the stress and the very question of how you balance it between the academic work, which is why you're there in the first place, extracurriculars, and for many people, jobs besides. Sometimes I wonder how collegians are able to do it. I mean, I think a lot of people don't appreciate, especially students who have to work and to earn money to go to college, the kinds of immense pressures they are under these days. And I have a lot of empathy for that and a lot of respect for the people who are managing it, I must say. What do you think, Mike, about that? That sort of balancing question of the various types of activities, the extracurricular. I suppose one way the stress comes is if you put too much time in on this committee you're on and then don't do your paper, and then you got stress at the end of the quarter, huh?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's true. I mean, if you have become so short-sighted that you've allowed yourself just to work on your committee or on whatever group you're in and your academic stuff, that's going to cause a great deal of stress and anxiety. Getting back to the balanced life, I think that's really the way to manage stress is to, balance out the academics with some extracurricular activity. And if you're working with your job, and put them all in perspective, saying they're all important, they all have to have their certain amount of time, but realizing, you have to set your priorities and all. But if you balance your life out, I find that it helps you to eliminate a lot of the stress that people who don't have a balanced life, who are so intense on one thing or another, that if you even things out, you can move along more levelly. You don't have to constantly be involved in just one thing. That helps to eliminate the stress, and you don't really feel as stressed out or
one of the key words in all that is balance, isn't it? And of course, in our culture as a whole, what often goes wrong is that people put so much effort and time into their jobs, earning money, that they don't put enough into personal development and don't put enough into family life. That's the pattern sort of in our culture today that is producing a lot of anxiety and stress. And again, by looking at the larger cultural picture, you begin to see that balance is crucial. People often feel better if they're able to cut back somehow on the intensity of the work, put in more time with their kids that they're raising or with their spouse, and also find some time for personal development, which in my outlook would include prayer and meditation and a relationship to church and to God and so on. That seems to be an important way to keep this larger perspective that you need. And now when you look at it from the collegiate level, it would seem like the primary reason you're there is to study. And that's what you're supposed to get out of college. You're supposed to hone your critical skills and learn to think more reasonably and argue logically and expand your imagination and so on. So that anything that would sort of take away from that in a significant way would have to be curbed. I think a lot of times they tell freshmen coming in, now don't sign up for everything, and everything will sound good to some people, and there's all these organizations pushing you to get involved, but stop and think a little critically. See how much time you really got left over after you spend your 40 hours a week studying, or however much it turns out to be. So when you begin to look at that balance, maybe you say it can go wrong from a number of viewpoints. One is you can get so immersed in your books that you got no time for social life, no time for organizations or for extracurricular activities, and therefore you become stunted in a way and maybe burned out with the books. The other way you get out of balance, it seems to me, is you get too involved in other things and don't attend to the thing you're supposed to be doing, which is to learn and put in your time in the classroom writing your papers and doing decently on your exams.
Well, I'd imagine that most college students who fail at being college students, who, for whatever reason have to leave the university, are because they don't have the balanced life. They have either come to school and decided all they're going to do is study, and they don't really develop personal relationships with other people. They don't have any sense of belonging to the university other than academically. So all of that weighs down so heavily that you just decide it's not worth it. Or you go to the other extreme where you become so involved in the activities that you have to leave the university because of your not being able to keep up with the academic standards. And it's the person who's balanced that's going to do well.
Yeah, a lot of times it's a matter of making prudent judgments. I think in my own life, when I was studying at Fordham and doing graduate studies in theology, and I took my studies very seriously and worked hard. And one time I had the opportunity of going to meet and interact with Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Worker and one of the greatest Catholics that has lived in the whole history of the United States. And for some reason, on that given evening, I thought it was more important to write this paper than to meet Dorothy Day. And I think what an imprudent judgment that was. I mean, in the long view of things, I never had the chance to meet this great, great person, a saint, holy person, but I got that paper done. I couldn't even tell you what the paper was about right now, or care about it. And I thought, boy, that was imprudent. It was a bit poor judgment in a given situation where I took the studies maybe too seriously somehow. So maybe the virtue of prudence is what we would really want to cultivate along this line. The virtue of prudence is that which enables us to make careful judgments that are in accord with reality and that figure in all the factors and discern what is to be done in the midst of very confusing and complex circumstances. Virtue of prudence is very crucial one, and it's one we really need to develop. St. Thomas Aquinas thought that it was sort of a key to the moral virtues because we're always in changing circumstances, and you want to develop the ability to think critically and to have perspective. I would say, well, what went wrong? Well, I didn't have the right perspective. I didn't realize that it was somehow a life event to be able to meet this woman, and that a paper wasn't all that important, or maybe getting a B on it was not the worst thing, rather than working extra hard to get the A. So their prudence, I'm suggesting, would be crucial to handling stress and to making good judgments along this line.
Right, I think that's true. We do, for our stress, it seems like we would create most of it ourselves, and that from our own decisions of what we've decided to see as important, if we've made bad decisions, then that's going to cause stress. If you are prudent and you can put things in the right perspective and get all your priorities set, the stress isn't going to be that great because you know what you're doing is right and you know that other things are afforded time too.
Yeah, you hit the key, I think, to all this, and that is that idea of perspective, seeing it in a proper context and so on. That's what enables us to function well. I mean, the external factors are the same for everybody. I mean, there's all kind of people running around the university with 16 hours to take and needing to spend 2.5 to 3 hours dealing with that material, and who have other activities and demands upon their time, maybe family, maybe extracurriculars, maybe a job. So the circumstances are pretty standard for people. The difference is that some people cope with it well because they have it in perspective. And I'd like to suggest that a lot of that is spiritual or religious, as I alluded to before. I mean, having the proper sense of doing God's will, or of trying to imitate the Lord, or of thinking of what we are about as spreading the kingdom, or whatever your language is, to see it in a religious perspective really is a great way to deal with stress. And maybe that's one of the things I hope that a parish can do, like Corpus Christi Parish, that we try to offer people this larger context of meaning, or a shared value system, and the dedication to Christ that could guide one and keep it all in perspective. You find that religious dimension helping you at all along that line?
Oh, I think it's a big help because it gives a lot of meaning to things that sometimes can seem meaningless. I mean, I'm sure every college student has been in the middle of a quarter or a semester and said, why am I here? What is this for? Why is there any value for me being in school? But if you have that sort of divine additive to your life where you're saying, this is possibly God's will, it helps to make those points when you might fall into despair seem a little brighter, and you can say, well, this is what I need to be doing right now. This is what is intended for me so that later on in life I'll be better prepared for whatever.
I think that's a really good point, Mike, that the motivational kind of question that you suggested there in dealing with stress, that there's a larger purpose in things. Why am I writing this paper again? But there's a larger purpose, and religion helps one see that bigger perspective, it seems to me. So we've been talking here about university life and coping with stress. There's a lot of it for collegians, and we try to deal with it in very practical ways, like avoiding procrastination and so on. But we also try to help ourselves with proper attitude, good perspective, especially something for us that flows from our religious outlook and our Christian faith.